Dobro, počinjemo drugi panel u okviru koga ćemo čuti...
Start with the second panel. We are going to hear about international experiences and recommendations about some practices, good practices. We have the university professor of political systems from Germany. For political systems, Germany and EU. Michael Koss. Hello, good to have you with us. It would be good to as we see that we are to control how to control solutions. Sorry for the speakers, maybe the moderator mentioned the names, but we didn't hear. Yeah. So how to go about them when we have solutions in place?
I'm sorry, is that a question already? And if it is, I didn't get it from the translation.
Nisam dobio.
Znači, kako uspostaviti, kako garantovati...
How to establish and how to guarantee independent control.
Thanks very much. And thanks also for having me. Well, I guess it's one thing, to have sanctions and a control body for political finance, and the other, of course, is to have these effective. And I guess you need to find the deal with a trade-off, because everyone is talking about independent control, but how independent can it really be? And that is the question, because if you have a control body for the exercise or supervision over party funding or political finance, and this body is really like independent also of political life, then experiences from foreign countries tell you that these people will either not really be able to understand, the problems and potential ways to deviate from the rules, and so they cannot really provide hands-on control. But if they're too close to politics, to real politics, so to speak, then of course the danger exists that these people, are following the illicit practices more than overseeing them. So there needs to be, you need to find the middle ground. And my hunch in that respect my proposal in that respect would be to have a body which is formally independent, of course, of political oversight, but does consist both of practitioners, politicians, or former politicians, but people who really know the rules of the game in terms of how politics are done factually in a particular country, and at the same time, people, say, from the legal system who do not necessarily have a political background, but are more savvy when it comes to the rules which are to be enforced. And I think as a rule of thumb, such a body would best be located with the audit office rather than with parliament, because parliament, this is, for instance, the case in Germany, where the supervision body is aligned to the president of the parliament. And my opinion is that this body is, per definition, so to speak, not really independent. That's why I would argue for the audit office. Thank you.
Dakle, pošto očigledno ne možemo računati na političku odgovornost.
We can't count on political responsibility. How important are sanctions, and what can you tell us about that?
I guess that sanctions is like the salt in the soup of political finance. I would call it, because without sanctions, we're all human beings, aren't we? Without sanctions, no one can seriously be supposed to obey rules not to talk of norms, informal norms, in the medium run. So there need to be sanctions, and I guess these sanctions need to be linked both to the particular breaches, so they should be proportional, to the degree to which one broke rules. For instance, if you, I like that about, for instance, the German system, where there are fees, financial fees, parties need to pay in case of wrongdoings, and these fees are related to the amount parties, did not declare, kept or spent for purposes different than declared in the financial statements, and so on and so forth. So, and ideally you have a...
sad ovdje, izvinite što vas prekidam, ali...
Sorry to interrupt. Here we have some paradoxical solutions that one party can, for example, draw 2-3 millions from abroad, and then they pay a fine of 20,000. How can this sanction and sanction policy be trivializing the whole story?
Yeah, I just took a look at the rules in Montenegro, and this is something which occurred to me. That's why I said the sanctions you pay, the fines you pay, need to be related to the money you dealt with illegally, and of course it needs to be more than the money you kept on the side, so to speak. So if you tell me that several millions are received from abroad, then I would say these several millions times 3, just to make a proposal, right? These several millions times 3 should be the sanction then. And I'm expecting the question, what to do if a party doesn't pay, or a politician, a candidate, whoever, doesn't pay that fee. I guess the ultimate solution, there's no ultimate solution. I should be frank, because, well, if players are not willing to follow the rules of the game at all, what can you do? I'm not sure. But one further step towards really effective sanctions would be to not allow either candidates to run again, or to parties to run again in elections. Only parties with clean sheets, so to speak, and only candidates with clean sheets should run for elections. And that, I think, is pretty serious, a sanction, which of course then needs to be enforced, and so on and so forth. But I guess that's as far as you can go from my perspective.
Mislite li...
Do you think that we should insist on more stringent sanctions in a system like ours, where still we don't have political party elites, where they don't have elementary sense, basic sense or shame, if you wish, for what they do wrong?
The brief answer would be yes. Because it's one thing to talk about the importance of transparency for democratic legitimacy, but the other, of course, is to ensure that at least a certain amount, limited, minimal amount of transparency is indeed established. And in doing so, I guess at least grave breaches of the rules of party funding count for me as indicators that there is no such thing as transparency. And, well, this is why I would argue for severe sanctions in case of severe wrongdoings, right? Not across the board. If you just take 1,000 euros, what do I know? This should be not that big a problem, but if it's structural and if it involves large amounts of money, well, then ultimately you either pay very high fees. That would be my advice, or my conclusion from West European experiences, or you're not allowed to run for elections anymore. Yes.
Hvala na učešću u ovom panelu, gospodine Koss. Evo, čuli smo dakle iskustva.
We have heard one experience. The next panelist is Dr. Ruiz, head of the Political Economy Research Division of the Government Department at the University of Essex. Have you established the link? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm good. I can hear you. Hi from the UK. So I brought a small presentation I'm an empirical research scientist. So I just want to show you the evidence that I found regarding money in politics, and I'm happy to take questions after. So if it's all right, I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen. Can you see it?
Možemo sve u redu.
It's all good. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I don't usually go to policy conferences, so I'm happy to hear what you think. But I'll tell you about the influence of money in politics, the consequences and regulations, and how I've used big data and some data science methods to look at corruption. So the motivation behind my research is that sometimes in countries, the delivery of public goods can go terribly wrong. So here, this is an example of a bridge that fell. It's suspicious because there was a road just going around the corner, but it's also suspicious because for hundreds of years as humanity, we know how to build bridges. So why do we have these bad outcomes? So the problem is beyond technical or income, because this is in Colombia. They had the money to pay for this bridge, this horrible thing that fell. The problem was politics. And politics in the sense that politicians were benefiting particular interests. Turns out that the contractor behind this bridge had received money in campaigns, and they gave the contract to someone without experience. So at the expense of the electorate, we elect politicians, we hope them to behave well. They can be beholden to the power of money because they end up representing donors who then end up doing public procurement jobs that can go wrong. So I think money in politics matters because politicians can be responsive to particular interests rather than the general constituency. And one form of money in politics that I study in my research is campaign contributions. This is something that's pervasive across the world. Over 179 democracies across the world allow some form of campaign contributions. So this is pervasive. There's people, money flowing into campaigns. So one of the two questions that I want to tackle is what happens in general when we elect a donor-funded politician? Or let me rephrase this in terms of counterfactuals. What would have happened if we did not elect a donor-funded politician? Maybe the bridge would still be there. Or maybe we wouldn't even have to contract a bridge that was unnecessary. The second question is related to what was discussed in the previous discussion. Is can we regulate or curb the influence of money in politics in democracies? So as I was telling you earlier, I use big data, causal inference techniques, and other methods to study two things: the power of money, the consequences of electing donor politician, and we'll study a form of regulation, the campaign contribution limits. This is something that is not, it's on the table for different democracies. Maybe we should limit the amount of money that goes through campaigns. This is something that has happened across the region I study, but I'm pretty sure there's cases in Montenegro. This is the former president of Peru, now in jail. One of the biggest roads that was connecting Peru to Bolivia was given to a donor of the president, similar story to the bridge. There were issues in the construction of the bridges, incorrect use of pavement materials. This road was supposed to cost $800 million, ended up costing 2,000, way overpriced. And this guy over here, no longer with us because he went to jail. He got $20 million in his campaign. That sounds a lot of money, but this company ended up getting a contract 100 times the size of the political campaign contribution. So this can be an issue. So is it the case that these politicians always benefit their donors disproportionately? How do they do it? And I think this one is an important one because there's many research that shows that money in politics can lead to access or contracts, but how do they do it? How do they trick the public procurement system? And ultimately, we care about this because we want to know if this is costly for society or not. Again, we elect politicians, we expect they're going to behave well, yet they could be representing the narrow interest of certain groups of people. So this could be costly in terms of misallocation of resources, but sometimes politicians need to hire people, and sometimes it's better to hire someone you know from before. And donors, on the other hand, could be picking the best candidate who picks the most effective contractor. So on the other hand, there's a separate hypothesis that maybe we need money in politics to help select the correct politicians with more experience, and then the politicians are hiring actually people that are competent. So it's not necessarily the case that it's always costly. That's why it's important to look at data. So I'm going to also check how these benefits are given to these donors. And what I did here for this case, but I'm also doing this research in the UK, I use unique links using IDs to link uniquely donors and mayors elected in Colombia. So this is an example of the data. I use some machine learning techniques to measure characteristics of the politicians, who they are, what's their demographic characteristics, but most importantly, this is public data that OECD countries have. UK has this data, France has this data. Every single contract that goes through the state needs to be published online. So here I have information about how big the contract is, what are they contracting, which is the place that is contracting the municipality that's giving this contract. And most importantly, I have here this unique ID. So with this unique ID, I started tying donors and contractors across the system. So I know who's giving money to who in the campaign and who's getting contracts in exchange. And here, since this is unique numbers, I've been doing this for the UK. It's a little bit trickier because people don't use IDs as much. I don't know the case of Montenegro, but I know in Spain they also have the system. So I'm able to link uniquely individuals and individuals also with their companies. So I know exactly who's giving money to who and who's getting public procurement contracts back. So this, in the y-axis here, is the probability of obtaining a contract in the system. Right of this cutoff over here is when we elect someone who's been funded by campaigns. Someone left of this cutoff is someone that has not been funding by campaigns. If your probability of obtaining a contract in the system would be completely unrelated to politics, this should look flat. However, if you give money to a politician and that politician barely wins, the probability of obtaining a contract more than doubles. And this is problematic because I started looking at in-depth studies. These places look quite similar, and I started finding trends in the data and in these cases. So one of it is I saw a lot of discretion. So the system, if it's a certain threshold, more than 10% of the municipality budget, they have to open for competition. There needs to be a panel, it needs to advertise several days. But if it's a small contract, less than 10% of the municipality budget, there can be a single bidder and no need for a panel. Turns out that also the rationale behind this was, well, it's a small contract. It's not necessary to do all this public procurement contract. It's no need to have a panel. Well, it turns out that they were calling their friends before the bid came. This was advertised in a minimum legally required 24 hours. And the only person that showed up to that bid was the donor of the politician. And this is perfectly legal because these are small contracts that they try to open. They don't open to competition just to avoid all the bureaucracy. But the cost of this is that it's more discretionary. So this is something that is pervasive across OECD countries. And what they were doing is many small contracts. So what happened is that there was lack of economic specialization. you showed up with these donors that not only were the only ones bidding, but they had all sorts of large diverse supplies, uniforms for the school, computers for the school, alcohol for the parties, food. So they completely forgot the existence of Adam Smith, and they started contracting all sorts of things. And this led to overpricing of contracts. And this is something that I detected with systematic patterns in the data, because these are not large infrastructure contracts. In a way, we observe what actually went very wrong, but this is something that goes undetected, and it's actually quite a lot of money. So I found a case of someone who were getting 86 contracts with a municipality after a donation. And one of them contracts were a little bit problematic. They were overpricing school lunches for children. So that had direct impact of educational outcomes to benefit their friends. So this had press coverage in Bloomberg a couple of years ago. Then NGOs started using my method of linking donors and contractors to report people to the authorities. So I can tell you this has been used by NGOs to actually use it. And I've been expanding this now to other OECD countries. But the follow-up question, I don't have too many minutes left, but what I started thinking after doing this paper is, well, we have these contractors who contract all sorts of things. They get access through money in politics. Can we do something about it? Can we curb the influence of money in politics? And there's something that's very common among the different tools that policymakers can use is the use of limits. So can we limit the amount of private funding in campaigns? And over 40% of the countries have some form of limit of how much money goes in. But are they effective? Until I made this paper, we didn't have any evidence about this. And what I used here is a regulation that, depending on the number of registered voters, there's a jump in the rule of how much money you can give. So here, let me just show you distribution. Here at 25,000 registered voters in this blue area, they can raise twice the money in politics. So here on the right side, they can raise up to 100 million pesos. That's around $20,000. And here to the left, they can raise $10,000. So what I use to try to study this among comparable, I pick up municipalities that are very close to this rule, except the fact that they have, they look quite similar. So municipalities with 26,000 registered voters or 24,000, except the rule. So over here, we allow more money in politics. Over here, we don't. So this is what is called a quasi-experimental design. And here, using my data, what I found is when you allow low contribution limits, the top donors of the winner campaign only give to 10%. When you allow more money into politics, the two top donors give 21% of the campaign. So this mayor in this world over here ends up being in the pockets of those two top donors. And these top donors end up getting more contracts for them because they had more influence. And because they had more influence, they end up having with contracts with less oversight and worse performance. So they took more time to execute and had cost overruns over here. Why? Because we allow more money into the system. Richer people were able to, in a way, capture the winner mayor who gave 20% of the campaign. And then these contractors over here end up performing worse in terms of time to execute and having cost overruns. So campaign limits can have an influence on the quality of public procurement because I was able to trace what happened in both systems. Just to wrap up, so what are the effects of money in politics from my research? So money in campaigns, there's other forms of money in politics such as lobbying, they can affect accountability and the quality of representational democracy, because you end up with people that mayors or politicians, they use discretion from the public procurement system. It was well-intentioned, let's not create all this bureaucracy, but they started using a lot of small contracts to overcome the public procurement rules. And this led to over contracting over costs. So I did data collection procedures from online data, and I use text analysis and identification technique to study this, but I also studied the influence of money in politics, and I can tell you that lower campaign limits does decrease the influence of wealthy people in politics and might lead to better public procurement outcomes. And I use this using similar identification techniques of quasi-experimental techniques. I have more research of money in politics, but you're welcome to look at my website. Thanks a lot for listening to me, and I'm happy to hear for more questions.
Zahvaljujem. Ima li nekih pitanja na kojima...
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Ako želi neko se uključi, evo prilike. Ima neko konkretno pitanje u vezi ove prezentacije. Evo imamo jedno pitanje, ja ću ga samo prenijeti. Dakle, kakva je sudbina donora?
What is the destiny of donors in all these situations?
Destiny as in... sorry, what do you mean by destiny?
What happens with them? What is your experience? What are the consequences?
So some of these donors who get contracts from another paper, what I observed is that people donate again in the following election, and they start donating to higher level offices. So what happens is that there's networks that are being formed across time, and they get strengthened. And the politician who gave a contract to that donor, when they run in the future, that donor is going to show up again to give a donation. So this is, in a way, a dynamic game where certain networks are being strengthened and certain groups keep winning because they keep giving contracts, who then part of those contracts go to donations in the future. And this relates to a big question in the literature, which is, does it pay to invest as a campaign donor? And at least in this system, it seems to be the case, because they persist in the system, and some of them become career donors. They start donating higher up and having even more influence.
Upravo u tom smislu smo i mislili kakva im je sudbina. Dakle,
yes, that's what we meant by destiny. They do survive. We wish to thank you for this useful presentation. Thanks once again.
Thanks to you.
The panelist was supposed to be Judith Sorensen from Chicago, Illinois, from Northwestern Pittsburgh School of Law. So she couldn't make it. She's a bit sick right now. So we go on to Magnus Öhman, Director of the Regional Europe Office and Senior Political Finance Advisor for the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Can we hear each other? Are we fine with connection? Hi, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Let me give you a couple of introductory notes before you start.
Right. So I've really enjoyed hearing from the two previous panelists. There is one angle I want to add to this. So we're talking about different regulations, whether it be sanctions or donation limits and so on. The thing that we need to bear in mind is that the vast majority of party and campaign finance regulations around the world are ignored. Violations occur with often total impunity. So there's a key aspect of this at making sure that any regulations we have are implementation friendly, that they can be implemented. So for me, as a rule of thumb, working a lot with is this type of regulations, and the implementation is an advice to legislators, to civil society groups, to journalists. Do not introduce a political finance regulation or even propose a political finance regulation unless you have a reasonably good idea of how compliance with such regulations can be monitored and how violations can be sanctioned. So in practical terms, for each proposed reform, whether that's a draft law presented in Parliament or in a report by a civil society group, there should be an explanatory note following, this is the rule that we propose, and this is how that rule can be implemented in practice. That's the key point that we need to have with it.
Izvinite ako vas prekidam.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to ask you specifically, it would be good if you could clarify to us, what do you hint at? Could you give us some concrete example? For example, when you say that some solutions or models are user-friendly, the others are not. So could you please help us visualize that?
Sure, thank you, absolutely. The starting point is, when you are thinking about we should have this rule, is put yourself in the shoes of the public institution that should sit down and actually implement these rules. I do completely agree with Dr. Koss, by the way. Having this mandate in Parliament, as we do have in Germany, probably not a good idea. Having it in an independent institution, an audit institution, anti-corruption body, electoral management body, is likely to work better. So some practical things. A number of countries ban campaign donations by companies that hold public contracts. And I think that's highly relevant to the presentation we just heard. Having donation limits can be of use, but in terms of reducing the influence of donations on the public procurement system, it may be more impactful to reduce or ban donations from those holding public contracts, and in reverse, banning those who make donations from receiving public contracts. The thing is, if you do that, the ones who are controlling this must be able to compare donation records with public procurement records, which is what we just saw in the presentation. There are many countries that have rules like this, but they haven't put that control in place. And in that case, you have a rule, but you can't control it. Another example, if you set a limit on campaign spending, which is common in about half of countries around the world, you must have a clear definition of what campaign spending is. And in a lot of countries, that's not clearly defined. It helps also if you require that campaign materials note who paid for them to allow for monitoring of whether a party or a candidate is following the spending limit.
A koja je po vama vrsta javne ustanove?
What is the best institution or the institution, public institution that is best positioned to do the oversight of political party financing?
So, excuse me. As I just mentioned, or mentioned a while ago, the institution needs to be independent. Which means that having it in Parliament may be tricky. Having it in a ministry, which we have especially in a lot of former Francophone colonies, is problematic. That's not the system in France, by the way. That's a different story. But then, so you should have it in an independent institution. The most common being anti-corruption bodies, audit institutions, or election management bodies. The last being the most common globally. And there are different pros and cons. You could say that election management bodies are more aware of politics than the others, but they are very sensitive. They don't want to get involved in anything sensitive because they have to be perceived as independent to be able to run elections. Audit institutions are much better at controlling money, but generally they don't understand politics. It's a huge difference of controlling a minister of transport and a certain political party, two different bodies. At the end of the day, what the most efficient institution is the one that has the sufficient mandate in the law and powers connected to that. There's a slight difference. Sufficient resources, independence, and will. If you don't have the will to act, nothing is going to happen, because this is very difficult issues. You need, as a public servant, to effectively take on the big political actors.
Zahvaljujem se, evo smo na današnji...
Thank you. We have so far heard at the panels how political elites look at the issue and how willing they are to do something. Thank you very much. And let me introduce the next panelist, Ms. Khushbu Agrawal, expert at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral System from Stockholm, Sweden.
Hello, a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us. So, to just pave the way, can you hear what are the chances and challenges that follow the link between digitalization and political finances or political funding?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. Well, it is no secret anymore that campaigning, the modes of campaigning have been evolving over the last decade, and political parties, candidates, and even third parties have been using different forms of digital campaigning methodologies. If we trace it back, the most prominent use of digital campaigning happened during the 2007-8 campaigning by President Obama in the US. But as we see 15 years down the line now, almost all countries across the globe are using some form of online campaigning. And of course, it brings a lot of opportunities, as you already asking me that question. In terms of opportunities, there are two aspects we can look at. The first aspect is campaigning online is much more affordable. So several candidates and political parties who are not as well resourced or don't have access to moneyed networks are actually able to reduce their cost of campaigning. And in fact, in India, studies showed that candidates who were less resourced were actually able to improve their profile by campaigning online. Similarly, if you look at donations perspective, it also allows for small donors to engage in politics and increase their political activism. Again, example of the US, Bernie Sanders was able to raise $210 million USD just by crowdfunding. And most of that donation happened from small donors who made donations online. So online sphere can provide a lot of opportunities, but at the same time, because it's a still relatively new area, it is definitely bound by many challenges. As we have already heard from the speakers, the last three speakers, the current regulatory framework, it exists in almost all countries, some form of political finance regulations, but they're already not very suitable for the analog world. So if you now add the layer of digital campaigning, it becomes even more challenging. And some of the challenges that I can think of are, let's say, tracing the source of funding, for instance, because everything happens in the online world, digital sphere. Anybody can probably hire somebody to run a Facebook page or an Instagram page or something on Snapchat. And you would never know unless there is a really strong payment systems, online payment systems, it would be impossible to track who actually made the payment. Then there is also the issue of speed of innovation. So the online world is constantly changing. There are new methodologies or new ways political parties can raise and spend money, cryptocurrency, for example. But at the same time, our legislative procedures are very... I think I was muted. I don't know how much you lost me. But yeah, I was saying that it's almost the innovation curve is almost ahead of our legislative curve. As a result, it's very difficult to catch up with what is happening in the online world. Then the third issue is the oversight capacity, and Magnus was mentioning about the capacity of legislative bodies or oversight bodies, and many of those bodies actually lack the capacity to monitor campaign finance online, which actually complicates the process even further. There are several other challenges, but I think I'll stop now, and maybe you have other questions, and I can add to that.
U ovako nedovršenim sistemima kao što je
In these incomplete systems, such as the Montenegrin one, what is the role of the international community and the professional NGO sector to deal with ensuring better oversight of the online campaigns?
Well, the role of both international organizations as well as CSOs, it can't be overstated. Even in the regular campaigning world or political finance world, we always emphasize the really important oversight and watchdog role that CSOs and media can play, and we have seen it across the globe. In, for example, USA, there is a Center for Responsive Politics, and through their website Open Secrets, they monitor the spending and fundraising of all political parties and use that information to generate awareness. But also in our parts of the world, for example, in Latvia, the CSOs have actually been very, very active in campaign finance world, and even in online campaigning. They were actually one of the first groups to bring to the attention of KINAB, the anti-corruption body, that the 2018 election could possibly have some sort of foreign influence. It was very important that there is some sort of transparency around who is funding campaigns, for instance. And as a result, KINAB took active steps to collaborate with social media companies and making sure that all the advertisements were marked on who paid for them, where the money came from. And at the same time, they even actually did a high-profile visit to the Silicon Valley, the Facebook office, to really raise awareness about the role that social media companies can play. And this was all spearheaded by CSOs. So obviously CSOs have a very important role, not just in oversight, but also I would say in doing research itself and bringing those numbers, crunching those numbers of what is happening, what political parties are spending on in terms of their campaigning, including online campaigning.
Hvala vam najljepše, ili ima možda
Thanks a lot. Are there any questions?
Može.
Hvala prije svega na prezentaciji.
Thank you for the presentation. I would like to hear about the communication between the state and the regulators of the elections, the competent agencies or whatever they are in the USA, with the social networks such as Facebook, Instagram. How do they regulate those relations? And for states such as Montenegro, which are much smaller and which cannot get in touch with these social networks, is there any tool to control that space, online space, if we know where the money comes from and we have those unofficial campaigns that are aimed against some political candidates? Can we have any way to respond to that, to tackle with that?
Thank you. Very, very interesting and very relevant question, I must say. So there are two aspects that we have to look at. One is the regulatory aspect. Are the current regulations of political finance adapt for the digital world? There are two schools of thought. One would say that online campaigning is just an extended branch of current campaigning methodologies, whereas another group would say that online campaign finance actually requires a whole overhaul of the regulatory mechanisms. So one way is to actually make sure that the current regulations are up to date and encompass the online campaigning realities, which would obviously mean making sure that digital advertisements are defined in the regulation. What do you mean by digital advertisements? Like Mexico did it in this case. By its 2007 constitutional reform process, Mexico found way to make sure that digital campaigning were actually incorporated into one of the methods of campaigning, and they have a very well-defined concept of what that constitutes, and also making sure that the regulations require social media companies to be transparent. And again, in case of Latvia, social media companies are actually required to post few months before the elections their price list of how much does it cost to buy advertisements on each of their platforms. At the same time, their contracts should be transparent. There should be a very clear way on how social media companies and political parties or candidates or third parties are signing contracts. And at the same time, each of the advertisement that is posted on any of the social media platforms should have a disclaimer of who paid, how much was paid, and for how long was the campaign run. And this has been done in Mexico and in Latvia, and it has been quite successful. And at the same time, apart from the regulation, there is also a different way. And I want to put it out there that there is no one size fits all. Every country is different, and things work differently in every country. But in case of Netherlands, for instance, International IDEA actually spearheaded a collaborative effort between political parties, civil society, and social media companies, where they all, prior to their last election, signed a code of conduct on online behavior. So basically, political parties committed not to post slanderous messages or spread misinformation during campaigning online, while social media companies agreed. And it was a voluntary conduct, which was actually appreciated by everybody. And social media companies committed to make sure that all the funding that is going for campaigning is transparent, and they provided records of all the payments that was received and who had made that payment. So there are different ways to look at it. It could be a regulatory way, but of course, like I said, the innovation in regulation is in social media campaigning is always faster than regulatory changes. So sometimes these kind of voluntary code of conduct, which has also been actually not just in Netherlands, but also Argentina in Latin America, they have also signed it in their last two elections. So something like that could possibly work in the case of Montenegro.
Hvala najljepše na izlaganju.
Thanks a lot for your presentation, for your responses. And now we have the last panelist, Oleksii from the International Foundation for Electoral Assistance from Ukraine.
Hello, everyone. Yes, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I was very happy to hear the presentation of my colleagues, and many of the things they said resonate with the situation with Ukrainian political finance. So I hope to somehow complement this comparative examples with a case study from Ukraine, and hopefully this would be somehow relevant to the situation in Montenegro. I will have a presentation. Just a moment. So I will talk about the political finance in Ukraine, and given the current the ongoing wars, the challenges that the situation with political finance has encountered. So I will touch upon four main topics. The first will be the situation with the political finance in Ukraine before the war. Then I will talk briefly about the changes brought by the war and how the war affected this sphere. Then I would speculate a bit how the situation could look like after the war, and then I will draw some conclusions that it can be applied for other countries as well. So, talking about the situation before the war, so actually for quite some time we could have said that Ukraine was quite a promising case. In some sense, a success story in like regulating political finance. It was a latecomer in terms of when the regulation was introduced, so it was only in 2015. But then there were quite some changes in how the system performed. The oversight with political finance lies with independent anti-corruption agency, and after its reboot in 2020, the oversight considerably improved, and we saw like for the first time that the rules are really being enforced, as Magnus mentioned previously, that it is very important that the rules be enforced. So like in 2020, we saw that those parties that breached the rules on how to use, for instance, public funding have been sanctioned, and actually 3 parliamentary parties where their public funding was suspended, which was quite a precedent, because one of these parties was the ruling one, which had the majority in the parliament, and they had their public funding suspended by the anti-corruption agency, and this was quite a progress compared to what Ukraine had previously, when like the ruling parties were somehow of the holy cow that couldn't be sanctioned in any way, and we saw that this could really happen. And furthermore, in 2021, we saw the introduction of the first ever digital reporting system for political parties, and it was it is basically one of probably the most user-friendly among the European countries, and it was launched in last year. But on the other hand, we saw like the big how these promising developments could stop and be reversed with just small changes. So in March 2020, when the COVID pandemic was in full speed, the parliament adopted the changes that allowed political parties not to submit financial reports until the COVID restrictions expire. And actually, we still have them in place until the end of this year, at least. So the parties are allowed not to report at all. And in response to these cases of like suspending public funding for parliamentary parties, there were a couple of attempts from the parliament to limit the mandate of the anti-corruption agency. They were so far unsuccessful, but we will see how the situation will evolve. So, and then the war came, and as you might imagine, it had quite profound impact on many areas, including political finance. So the first big change was that the agency.
To sam I želio da vas pitam, da li je političko finansiranje...
This is exactly what I wanted to ask you. Is it a topic of interest at all for Ukrainian civil society and citizens right now, given the circumstances, or it has... is it at all possible, given the context of war?
Yes, thanks for the question. It is indeed like one of the problems that that now like public and civil society cares not as much as they did before, and actually like civil society like directed their attention at different problems and different issues, and this reform was like is not on the agenda right now, and this is one of the problems why like these steps to reverse the gains of the reform are so easily implemented. So an ECP, the agency that reviews the reports, was actually barred from reviewing the reports during the war, and parties were given like second exemption from submitting the financial reports, as the register as it received party finance was closed, and the reports were removed from the website. So actually we have like quite a void of the reform because of the war, but actually it is these steps are I mean, could be explained more by the willingness of the ruling party and as a parliament, as a parliament as a whole, to decrease the overall transparency in this area and to limit, like to basically to destroy like public oversight with political finance. So it is a big problem, and it is really the case that the war was used as a pretext to close down on some of the achievements that were done previously. So when I think about what the situation might look like in the future, there are some dangers that might manifest in Ukraine after the war if the situation continues as it is. So as I've said, like I expect further decrease in transparency of political finance due to the non-reporting. The problem with the state oversight is that it is still paralyzed, and nobody knows when the agency will be able to resume the review of party reports. The public attention to the political finance reform is at the lowest point because of the objective reasons. And like the final point is that we see already some examples of increasing abuse of state resources, and I suspect that this might increase following the war, given that the ruling party and like the politicians that are in power are gaining popularity during the war and concentrating power, and then they can use it for their benefit and against the law, but according to the political interests. And so to conclude, I draw some implications for other countries. Probably they could be of some relevance to Montenegro as well. So many of my colleagues talked about like the importance of enforcement and of sanctions, and I agree completely with that. I just would like to add that transparency is still a backbone of an effective political finance regime, and that without transparency you wouldn't know how to apply sanctions, you wouldn't know who committed violations. And now we are in a situation that we have quite a strong political finance regime, we have quite strong regulations, we have an oversight in place, we have sanctions in place, but actually nobody knows anything. Like nobody knows how parties are being financed, how they spend their money, and nobody can do anything even with this quite strong sanctions and instruments for enforcement. And so political parties will do anything to get rid of this transparency, because it is very sensitive to them, and they will use different pretexts to decrease it. Talking about other implication is that in Ukraine we saw how like applying sanctions and enforcing rule could also backfire, as in case of suspending public funding of political parties, which resulted in the same political parties like uniting between themselves in trying to limit the mandate of the oversight institution. So my conclusion is that the oversight institution should not only pay attention to sanctioning and to enforcing rules, but also engaging with parties and trying to prevent the violations before applying sanctions. And that could, in the long run, that could have more effective outcomes than just blunt application of sanctions when they see the violations. Probably not surprisingly, the war and any kind of armed conflicts could have long-lasting negative implications on democratic reforms, on democratic accountability, and this is what we see now in Ukraine, and not only in the area of political finance, but also in many other areas where many registers are being shut down, transparency are being decreased, and public knows less and less about like politics and really what's going on, because those in power say that during the war we cannot share this information, it is sensitive and so on and so forth, but in fact they actually use this situation to close down many of the information that was available before. And finally, I think that public should be a stakeholder in this process, because when we see that public has no interest in political finance or in some other reforms, it is very easy for politicians to reverse some of the gains that have been made. They see that public basically doesn't care about whether we have strong political finance regulation or not, and they use it to just reverse some of the gains, to close, to decrease transparency, to paralyze oversight, and in that case the situation becomes very
Koliko god bile sumorne ove vaše post-ratne predikcije.
No matter how dismal those post-war projections are, the only thing we could wish for is that the war comes to an end sooner rather than later. Other questions? There is. Thank you for your presentation. My question is, given that the civil society organizations are key to players in improving the transparency and fight against corruption and fight against embezzlement or misuse of funds, does civil sector in Ukraine feel, so did the incumbency in Ukraine retaliate against them, meaning that they were deprived of some of the tasks or privileges or whatever? Did you see any effect to that?
Thank you for your question. So actually, we had such experience previously, actually before 2014, when civil society organizations were targeted by the ruling, by those in power, like for as a kind of retaliation for what they do for the watchdog activities. So the situation improved basically after like 2014, but now, like after the war, we see that those problems might return, and we should expect that those who will try to put a spotlight on some shady activities, or including political finance, might be in danger. So we will see. My answer is that before the war, the situation was quite okay, because it is improved significantly since 2014. But we'll see how it evolves after the war.
Hvala najljepše. Dakle, sa ovim zaključujemo i drugi panel. Kratka pauza.